There's an old military saying that's often attributed to General Omar Bradley. Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. It's a lesson that Washington seems to have forgotten in recent years. For the last 2 decades, the United States has been run by individuals who love to talk about grand strategies. They discuss Indo-Pacific containment, freedom of navigation, and they move aircraft carriers around like game pieces on a map. They believe that, as the world's mightiest superpower, no one can touch them. But while Washington was preoccupied with strategy, China was focusing on something far more important: logistics. This week, the professionals in Beijing taught the amateurs in Washington a painful lesson. In a move that barely made headlines amid the election frenzy, China imposed severe sanctions on 9 major U.S. defense companies. These sanctions froze assets, blocked transactions, and made it clear that China controls a crucial element of the U.S. military's supply chain. But the most significant part of this move wasn't the sanctions themselves, it was what China stopped. Beijing has cut off exports of critical minerals, specifically antimony. Most people probably haven't heard of antimony, but this mineral is vital for the United States military. Antimony is used to make armor-piercing bullets, night vision goggles, missile guidance systems, and even nuclear weapons infrastructure. Yet, here's the alarming statistic. The United States imports almost all of its processed antimony, and the vast majority of it comes from China. This presents a major problem for Washington. The United States is building weapons out of Chinese minerals. It has an $800 billion defense budget, the most expensive military equipment in the world, yet none of that matters if they don't have the raw materials to build those weapons. The U.S. military is dependent on China for key materials, and China is now using this to its advantage. By restricting exports, China isn't just hurting U.S. companies, it's shutting down the U.S. industrial supply chain. The Pentagon is well aware of the crisis unfolding. They've been frantically searching for new suppliers, even considering countries like Tajikistan, or asking domestic mines to reopen. But the reality is that you can't fix 30 years of industrial neglect in 30 days. The U.S. military's arsenal of democracy is running on empty, and the supplier just quit. This shift marks the beginning of a new kind of industrial war. The U.S. has waged financial warfare for years, using tools like economic sanctions to isolate its enemies. When the U.S. wants to hurt Russia, they freeze bank accounts. When they want to punish China, they blacklist companies. The weapon of choice has been the dollar. But now, China has unveiled a much more effective weapon supply chains. When China sanctioned those 9 U.S. defense firms, they didn't just freeze money, they stopped the flow of essential materials. This is disastrous for companies like Sierra Nevada Corporation, which build advanced planes and spacecraft for the U.S. military. They rely on complex, global supply chains that pass through China. Without access to Chinese-made rare earth magnets, processed aluminum, or electronic components, their assembly lines come to a halt. The irony here is palpable. The U.S. imposed sanctions on China, hoping to limit its military rise. But in doing so, they've created a boomerang effect, with those same sanctions now coming back to disrupt their own military-industrial complex. And the timing couldn't be worse. Right now, the U.S. defense industry is already struggling. The U.S. military can't produce enough artillery shells to keep up with Russia in Ukraine, and it's facing a similar shortfall in missile systems. Why? Because for decades, the U.S. prioritized efficiency over industrial capacity, closing factories and offshoring critical production. They outsourced the processing of gallium for aerospace parts, germanium for fiber optics, and antimony for ammunition, all to China. Now, as the Chinese government tightens the grip on these materials, the U.S. is learning a hard lesson. While the U.S. could print more money, it can't print a gallium mine or a refinery. This is a situation where raw materials matter more than financial power. This is where the difference between financial warfare and industrial warfare becomes crucial. For the past 2 years, the U.S. has waged a financial war against its adversaries. When Washington wanted to hurt Russia, it froze bank accounts and isolated the country from the global financial system. When it aimed to punish China, it blacklisted companies, attempting to isolate them from the international market. The weapon? The dollar. Washington's strategy was simple. Cut off a country's access to global finance and it would collapse. But China has shown that there is a much more powerful weapon in place: supply chains. Instead of freezing assets, China has cut off access to critical materials that the US military depends on. It's not just about blocking financial transactions. It's about halting the supply of essential resources needed for weapons production. This move has massive consequences for US defense contractors, particularly those involved in high-tech surveillance, aerospace, and weapons manufacturing. Companies like Sierra Nevada, which build advanced planes and spacecraft, now face a crisis. They rely on a global supply chain that, whether they like it or not, runs through China. Without access to Chinese-made rare earth magnets, processed aluminum, and electronic components, their production lines come to a grinding halt. This isn't just a minor inconvenience. It's a fundamental issue for the U.S. defense industry, one that's already on the edge. As we've seen in Ukraine, the United States, despite its status as a global superpower, struggles to produce enough ammunition to meet the demands of war. It can't even build enough Patriot missiles to protect its allies. Why? Because, for the last 40 years, the U.S. has prioritized just-in-time efficiency, closing factories, reducing stockpiles, and outsourcing everything to places like China. China, on the other hand, has been steadily building the industrial base the U.S. let crumble. While the U.S. was focused on the financial markets and abstract strategies, China was building the infrastructure to control the flow of critical materials. The U.S. military can't just print more metal or create a factory overnight. It takes years to build mines, refineries, and manufacturing plants, and the U.S. neglected these areas for decades. Even if they tried to reopen mines, as they are now in Idaho with the Stibnite Antimony mine, they face countless bureaucratic hurdles. The permitting process is bogged down by environmental lawsuits and government red tape, making it impossible to restore these essential industries in a timely manner. The process of refining and processing raw materials is also a significant challenge. The U.S. outsourced the expertise and infrastructure needed to turn raw ore into usable, high-quality materials. It is much more than just digging minerals out of the ground. Turning those raw materials into the metals and alloys needed for defense technologies requires complex chemical engineering, energy-intensive processes, and highly skilled labor. And in this area, the U.S. has been left behind. China has continued to build and expand its refining capacities, while the U.S. has allowed its own processing capacity to atrophy. If the U.S. were to reopen the Stibnite mine today, it would likely face the harsh reality that it would have to ship the ore to China for processing, only to buy it back at a higher price. This is a perfect example of how the U.S. has become a paper tiger when it comes to its military capabilities. On paper, the U.S. military looks formidable: 11 aircraft carriers, F-35 fighter jets, and a defense budget that dwarfs the next 9 countries combined. But in reality, this military is fragile. It's dependent on global supply chains, and those supply chains are controlled by countries like China. The U.S. National Defense Stockpile, which once served as an emergency savings account for critical minerals, is now a shadow of its former self. During the Cold War, it was worth $42 billion adjusted for inflation. Today, it's valued at less than $1 billion, and some argue it is effectively insolvent. Over the years, Congress has sold off portions of the stockpile to fund tax cuts and welfare programs, operating under the assumption that the global market would always provide what they needed. But in a time of conflict, there is no global market. There are only allies and adversaries. And right now, the US main rival controls the most critical resources. By restricting the exports of minerals like antimony, gallium, and germanium, China is sending a clear message to Washington. They are not just closing a door, they are turning off the lights. They're showing the US that it is vulnerable, that its military-industrial complex is built on a foundation of sand. And without these essential resources, the US military's high-tech capabilities could come to a halt. China doesn't need to fire missiles to disrupt the U.S. U.S. military. It just needs to stop issuing export licenses for these critical materials. This is the grim reality the Pentagon is waking up to. The U.S. military is built on advanced technology. But this technology depends on a steady supply of raw materials. Materials that, increasingly, China controls. And what China is doing right now is not just about weakening the U.S. military. It's about exposing a deep vulnerability in the U.S. industrial base. For decades, the United States has outsourced its manufacturing capabilities, focusing on financial power, while letting its industrial capacity erode. The end result is a military that is technologically advanced, but dangerously dependent on foreign supply chains for the very materials it needs to function. If the Pentagon thought it could continue relying on global markets to supply the raw materials for weapons production, it's quickly realizing how fragile that assumption was. The real shock is not just that China has the power to disrupt the US military, it's that the US has allowed itself to become dependent on its greatest geopolitical rival for such critical resources. In this new age of warfare, raw materials are as important as military strategies. The idea that the US could remain a military superpower while simultaneously allowing its industrial base to atrophy is no longer sustainable. What's happening with antimony is a stark illustration of this collapse. The United States once had domestic sources of antimony, like the stibnite mine in Idaho. During World War II, this mine was essential to the country's war effort. But today, that mine is shut down, and efforts to reopen it have been thwarted by years of bureaucratic red tape and environmental lawsuits. The U.S. is stuck in a kind of industrial paralysis. China, on the other hand, is building new mines and refineries at a pace that the U.S. can no longer match. It can open a new mine and build a refinery in 2 years. The U.S. is looking at 10 to 15 years to get the necessary permits to even begin the process of reopening a mine, if it ever happens at all. This is a perfect example of how China has managed to outmaneuver the U.S. In the industrial realm, while Washington focused on financial strategies and grand military posturing, Beijing worked quietly behind the scenes to dominate the global supply chains of key minerals. And now, China is using its control over these resources as a powerful weapon. The U.S. military is finding that it can no longer simply print more money to solve its problems. It can't just rely on financial markets to solve its raw material shortages. The Pentagon is realizing that the physical materials it needs to operate its advanced technology are now in the hands of China. The failure of the U.S. to maintain its industrial base is not just a failure of policy, it's a failure of imagination. For decades, American leaders have assumed that they could dominate the world economically and militarily, without recognizing the fundamental importance of a strong industrial base. The decision to outsource critical manufacturing and processing to other countries, particularly China, was sold as a way to improve efficiency and cut costs. But now, as China turns the screws on the global supply chain, the U.S. is finding that those efficiencies came at a heavy price. This is not just about the loss of access to antimony or gallium. This is about a much larger problem, the decay of America's industrial power. And it's a problem that is only getting worse. As China continues to build its industrial base and expand its control over critical resources, the U.S. finds itself increasingly dependent on foreign supply chains that are controlled by its rivals. This is a strategic vulnerability that could have devastating consequences not just for the U.S. military, but for its economy and global standing. But it's not just the U.S. military that is feeling the impact of this industrial collapse. The entire U.S. economy is at risk. The outsourcing of critical industries has led to a hollowing out of the country's manufacturing capabilities. This has created a situation where the U.S. no longer has the capacity to produce essential goods domestically. It is increasingly dependent on countries like China to supply the raw materials and finished products that keep its economy running. And as the world's other great powers, Russia, China, and the emerging BRICS nations secure their own resources and build alternative supply chains, the U.S. is being left behind. The global economic system is shifting away from the U.S. dollar, and the American military-industrial complex is being exposed for what it is: a brittle, fragile system that is entirely dependent on a functioning global supply chain. But what happens when that supply chain breaks down? The U.S. has no contingency plan, and as China's sanctions prove, the consequences of that oversight are already being felt. When the world's leading superpower finds itself relying on its greatest rival for key materials, it sends a powerful message to the rest of the world. It's a message of weakness. And as China continues to demonstrate, it is the country that controls the supply of critical minerals that holds the true power in the modern world. The situation has become even more dire when we consider how the US responded to this emerging crisis. Washington is scrambling to fix the problem, but the reality is that they're facing a mountain that will take years, if not decades, to climb. The US is now trying to bring some of these critical industries back home, but it's a difficult task. Even as they try to reshore manufacturing and revive domestic production, the clock is ticking, and the situation continues to worsen. It's not just about reopening mines or factories. It's about rebuilding entire industries that have been dismantled over the past 40 years. The problem is compounded by the fact that the US no longer has the same industrial base it once did. The country outsourced its manufacturing capabilities, relying on financial markets and services for economic growth, while ignoring the critical importance of maintaining a robust industrial infrastructure. China, on the other hand, made the opposite choice. While the US was focused on financial dominance, China worked on strengthening its industrial base, building up its mining and refining capacities, and securing key resources. Now, when the US needs these resources the most, China is in a position to use its control over these materials as a powerful leverage point. This imbalance is not just a matter of military power. It's a fundamental shift in the global economic order. The United States, once the leader in industrial manufacturing, has become a financial superpower that no longer produces the physical goods needed to maintain its own military and economy. The US military, for all its technological sophistication, is now vulnerable to the whims of countries like China that control the raw materials necessary for its functioning. This is a stunning reversal of the global power dynamic, one that is difficult for many in Washington to accept. The irony is that the US military, the most advanced and expensive military in the world, is finding itself exposed in a way that was once unimaginable. Its reliance on foreign supply chains for critical materials means that its technological superiority is no longer assured. The precision-guided munitions, the aircraft, the missiles, everything that makes the US military so powerful depends on materials that are increasingly controlled by China. And as China continues to tighten its grip on these resources, the US military's ability to produce these systems is being compromised. This is where the long-term consequences of US industrial neglect are becoming painfully clear. The US has spent decades ignoring the importance of maintaining a strong industrial base, and now it is paying the price. China, with its deep focus on logistics and supply chains, has quietly built the infrastructure to dominate the production of critical minerals and materials. While the US was busy with financial strategies and military posturing, China was strengthening its industrial base, positioning itself to hold the key to the global supply of these vital resources. In a world where industrial power and military power are increasingly intertwined, the US has failed to recognize the importance of maintaining its own supply chains. It has outsourced too much, relied too heavily on foreign suppliers, and ignored the long-term risks of depending on rivals like China for critical materials. As a result, the US finds itself in a perilous situation, one where its military and economic power are no longer guaranteed. The US may have the largest defense budget, but without access to the resources needed to build its weapons, it is losing its competitive edge. China's decision to restrict the export of essential minerals like antimony is a wake-up call. It's a clear message to the US that the era of relying on global markets for critical resources is over. The balance of power is shifting, and the US is no longer in control. The once unthinkable idea of a superpower being dependent on its rival for the materials needed to wage war is now a reality. The Pentagon is scrambling to find solutions, But the truth is that these solutions will take years to implement, and the clock is ticking. The loss of access to key materials like antimony is just the beginning. As China continues to tighten its grip on global supply chains, the US will find it increasingly difficult to maintain its military edge. This isn't just a problem for the Pentagon, it's a problem for the entire US economy. The country's reliance on foreign supply chains has left it vulnerable to disruptions, and the consequences of this vulnerability are becoming more apparent with each passing day. As the situation unfolds, it's becoming clear that the US is entering an era of vulnerability it has long ignored. The core of American power, its military-industrial complex, is based on fragile global supply chains that are increasingly out of its control. The US might have the largest military budget, the most sophisticated technology, and a global network of allies, but all of that is meaningless if it cannot access the raw materials required to maintain its military edge. This is the harsh reality that Washington is facing, and it's not something they can fix overnight. China's ability to control critical resources is a strategic advantage that the US cannot afford to ignore. By restricting exports of key minerals like antimony, gallium, and germanium, China is sending a clear message to the US. You cannot maintain global dominance if you are dependent on your rivals for the very materials that fuel your military. The US has outsourced its industrial capabilities, assuming that the global market would always be at its disposal. But as the geopolitical landscape shifts, that assumption is proving to be dangerously flawed. The US is now scrambling to find alternatives, trying to reopen mines and revive domestic processing capabilities. But the reality is that it will take decades to rebuild the industrial base that has been outsourced over the past 40 years. The problem is not just about finding new suppliers or reopening old mines. It's about rebuilding an entire infrastructure that has been dismantled. In the meantime, China is tightening its grip on the global supply chain, and the USS is finding itself at the mercy of Beijing's decisions. This crisis is not just about the US military's dependence on China for key minerals. It's about the broader implications for the US economy. The outsourcing of manufacturing has left the US with a fragile industrial base, vulnerable to disruptions in global supply chains. While China has invested in its industrial infrastructure, the US has relied on financial markets, assuming that it could always buy what it needed. But now, as China demonstrates, financial power alone is not enough. The true power lies in controlling the physical resources that fuel industries and militaries. The US military is a symbol of American power, but its reliance on foreign supply chains exposes a deep vulnerability. The precision-guided weapons, the high-tech aircraft, and the advanced missile systems are all built on a foundation of materials that are increasingly under China's control. If China continues to restrict these exports, the US military's ability to function could be severely compromised. This is not a hypothetical threat, it is happening right now. The economic and military consequences of this shift in power will be felt for years to come. The US can no longer afford to ignore the importance of industrial power. The country must rebuild its industrial base, but that will take time, and the window of opportunity is closing. As China continues to strengthen its control over critical resources, the US will find itself increasingly sidelined in a world where industrial and military power are inseparable. In the end, the US faces a stark choice. It can continue to rely on a global supply chain controlled by its rivals, or it can begin the long and difficult process of rebuilding its industrial base. But that process cannot be rushed, and the longer the US waits, the more vulnerable it becomes. The game is changing, and the US has to wake up to the reality that military and economic power are no longer separate entities. They are intertwined, and the nation that controls the resources controls the future. The final blow to the US. You might not come from a military defeat on the battlefield. It might come from an industrial collapse, from the realization that the arsenal of democracy has been outsourced to the very country it seeks to counter. Washington may be in a panic now, but it's far too late to fix decades of neglect. China's sanctions have exposed a fundamental flaw in US strategy, the reliance on foreign supply chains for critical resources. And as the global balance of power shifts, the US is being left behind.